Welcome to Sunday School. The Lord be with you. I'm pleased that Amanda let me join her today. Thank you, honey.
You're very welcome.
So you're all very welcome to our discussion today on St. Francis and St. Clare, continuation on our theme on the mystics and monastics. And we'll start with an opening prayer. Shall we? Please pray with me. Gracious God, we come together this morning in a spirit of curiosity and openness to learn about the lives of your Christian servants, Francis and Clare. We pray that our hearts and minds are illumined by their faithful witness, encouraged by their steadfast devotion, and inspired by their courageous service. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Last week we talked about Hildegard and St. Bernard, and remember they were from Germany and France respectively. This week we're all about Italy, and we're talking about St. Francis and St. Clare. You can see on the timeline they're about 100 years or so after last week's Hildegard and Bernard. And interestingly enough, we can see sort of the duration of how long they lived. Hildegard, as you remember, had a focus on good health, and she had all of these herbs and a lifestyle. She had a long age of about 87 years old, which is very unique in that time. In contrast, St. Francis burned out fast. He died in his 40s. And in some ways it's attributed to his lifestyle as well, and we'll talk about that today. Anything else here?
You just said what I would have said, so that's good.
Amanda and I were telling our earlier class that we're the just-in-time team, so we're going to be like just in time with this. So, yes, with St. Francis and St. Clare. So as we know, St. Francis is probably the most popular of the saints. They say that he's second in popularity only to Mary. But anybody in here ever heard of St. Francis? Anybody have a lawn ornament, a St. Francis lawn ornament? Yeah, like one of those.
Or a bird bath.
Or a bird bath. Or some art in your house, any kind of art in your house, or things like that.
Yeah.
Statue.
Is that St. Francis of Assisi?
St. Francis of Assisi, yes.
We've been there, right?
Okay.
How many of you have heard of St. Clare? So, quite a few. How many of you have any St. Clare things? We don't, right? Because you really don't see that. But St. Francis you do. Yeah, lots of St. Francis stuff. But they were partners in ministry.
They were. And they're both from Assisi in Italy. How many folks have been to Assisi in this room? Okay, so we'll have, during this talk, we'll have a couple photographs and some things and invite your reflections as well of of Assisi. Both of these saints are patron saints of Italy, and patron saints of a lot of things. If you go to Wikipedia or you go to the sites about St. Francis, you'll see that he's a patron saint of pretty much everything, including Salina, Kansas.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just random things. There's a whole
Yeah.
list, and like Salina, Kansas is on there. So yeah,
Yeah.
lots of them.
But notably animals and ecology and merchants. And then St. Clare is the patron saint of eye disorders and television. And we'll talk about that in more detail.
Yeah, we'll explain why that is as we keep going.
So a bit about St. Francis. And what we've structured this for is to talk about Francis and Clare together. Their lives overlapped, they were close friends, and so we'll talk about them together. This is kind of a summary of where we'll go with Francis. As we can see, he lived in his mid-40s, he's from Assisi. His feast day is October 4th. He died on the evening of October 3rd. And Jesus was the core of Francis' life, following Jesus. There's a very important early story about Francis where he sees Jesus in a leper. And he goes to the leper and kisses the leper. And as we talk about both these saints today, we'll talk about those stories and those metaphors, those things that help us understand maybe the meaning behind something deeper. But Francis kissing the leper is akin to us kissing whoever is on the margins in our lives. And it's that same kind of relationship that he shows. And it's him seeing Jesus in the other, in the marginalized, which is the profound point that we're going to talk about. Francis had a lot of poetic language. He talked about being married to Lady Poverty. He talked about illness as his sister, his body as brother donkey. And he had this sense of poetry in his language. That is probably one of the things that helped make his stories and his preaching amplify further. Because people could remember the stories, and they could remember these metaphors.
With respect to poverty, did he, other than prayer and hope for the people, did he teach them, and did they learn techniques to pull them out of poverty in some way?
Well, he took a vow of poverty, actually extreme poverty. And so his whole order and the Poor Clares, they lived a life. One thing I would say, Martin Luther, in the Large Catechism, if you look at his explanation of the first commandment, how we're to, have no other gods, we love God, we have only one God, Martin Luther has a wonderful explanation of that. And one of the things that he says in that explanation is that what we love becomes a God for us. And so therefore anything that is not related to God can become idolatry. And so we can think in our own lives, what are the things that we serve or that we love, that we occupy our time, that these things can become our gods, our little mini gods. And so in a similar way, for St. Francis and Clare, this is a really extreme example of taking very seriously this loving God above everything else, to the point of living in this extreme poverty. They weren't going to have any riches, anything of comfort, that their sole comfort is the love of God, and that they trusted that God is with them. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of that. So yes, they helped the poor, but for them, poverty was a gift. And they didn't walk around in sackcloth. Well, they weren't walking around in sackcloth, but they weren't walking around that sackcloth and ashes imagery of kind of this. There was joy. There was joy in it. So we're going to explore that. I did want to draw your attention. I know not everybody got one of these. We ran out of copies, but there's a timeline of St. Francis, and on the other side, there's a timeline for St. Clare. This hits all the major points. We don't have enough time, as you know, to go into all this. We're just going to hit some highlights. And what Eric's kind of teeing up is this idea that there were some pivotal moments, some pivotal key moments that started this transformation. And you'll find this, think of Luther who got struck by lightning, or if you look at a lot of these saints, often there was some event that happened that kind of made them have this sort of radical transformation. And we almost can say, you really could almost say that no one quite as radical as Francis and Clare. What they did is pretty. And I did want to also just have this, keep this in the back of your mind as well as we begin this morning. I think there's something that we have a tendency to do, because this was 800 years ago. We have a tendency to say, well, a lot of people might have been poor, walking around in, sackcloths. And so how radical was this really? So I'm here to just say it was radical. Both Clare and Francis were very well off, came from very well off family. Clare's family was nobility. They were even a higher echelon up from St. Francis's dad, who was a merchant, a cloth merchant. He was, very well to do. But Clare was even higher. She was in the noble realm. So they were coming out of this space in Assisi at the time that had a lot of wealth. There was a lot of wealth. Can you imagine, as the story unfolds, to have your son or daughter, but particularly your son in this case, walking around in sackcloth, preaching about the gospel, not having any money, not knowing where his food would come from, was a beggar, but had a joy and trusted God would take care of him. That's radical. That was radical then, and if you can imagine it today, it would be radical, and we would think he was crazy. We would. Many of us would think something's wrong with this person. Get this person help, right? Well, people thought the same back then too. The difference is it started to catch on, and we'll see that.
So rolling the tape back a little bit, Francis was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. At the time, there were battles going on with the local villages and things, and so he would have been a soldier, he would have gone to war, he would have been a prisoner, he would have been injured in war, and he would have been a rich kid. And as part of his early adulthood, coming back from battle, there's this story about him going into the chapel at San Damiano. Now, as we talk about the mystics and the monastics, one of the dominant themes that Amanda highlighted last week is about awareness. That the spiritual practices that they practice and that we practice are about gaining awareness of the holy. That God is already here. God is doing something. God is all around us, and it's about gaining that awareness. Some of these stories highlight maybe a mystical experience of gaining that awareness. This first one was in the sanctuary of the small church that was in disrepair in San Damiano. And this is where this famous crucifix comes from. And it's a large cross that's in the suspended, and it's about 5 feet wide. St. Francis himself is about a 5 foot tall person, so it's imposing for him. He's praying in front of it, and he has this experience. And the art of it, we have a little book on the side that describes some of the art. It's pecan wood, it's got a cloth over it, and it's an icon painted on the cloth. We have a copy of it that we got in Assisi here up on the wall, and there's a little book, like I said. But the story is that St. Francis came and was praying. It says, while he was walking near the church of San Damiano, an inner voice spoke to him and said, go in and pray. He obeyed, and kneeling before an image of the crucified Savior, he began to pray most devoutly. A tender, compassionate voice then spoke to him. Francis, go and repair my house, which you see is close to ruin. Trembling and amazed, Francis replied, gladly I will do so, Lord. Francis felt that voice was telling him very specifically and peculiarly to focus on that church where he was. Fix his house. And so that's what Francis did. He focused on that church in San Damiano, and he rebuilt it. And then we'll see that he also goes to another church and rebuilds it. And then as the arc of his life goes, he understands that that voice was talking about something much bigger than just that one little building. He's talking about the church universal. An important piece here with this cross, actually, that I would highlight is how it sort of intersected our own story, Amanda and I. So we, for some reason, have appreciated St. Francis through our lives. And when we lived in Ireland, had the joy of going to Assisi. And this little icon was painted by the monks there at the Basilica. We brought it back home and had this conversation about where to put it on the wall. And my thought is, let's put it right in the front door. And Amanda's thought is, no, it's way too imposing. So we had it on a couch in the side room in our deliberation of where would we put it. And one night, it was a Friday night, we took the girls to Dublin to go to a youth group event. And we left the house lights off. There was a gate that the driveway had that was left open. And when we came home, the girls weren't with us. Amanda and I came home, and we found shattered glass all through the house. And we had been victims of a smash and grab robbery. And what we had learned was, and all the doors in the house were open, and what we learned from the police was that this kind of thing happens where people smash through a door or a window, they come in, they ransack the place looking for cash, and they leave. And so we had these ransacked bedrooms, ransacked sock drawers. The police told me that, because they took some cash out of my sock drawer. I'm like, how do they know? He said, every person puts cash in their sock drawer. The thing that was amazing to me was that the couch, the room where that icon was sitting, when you open the door, is the first thing you would see. And so I know that the thief came in through that way. And then at the other door that was left open, they said that all the doors get left open so the thieves can leave if they hear any noise. So they prop all these doors open. Fortunately for us at that time, side note, our little dog was in a kennel, so she was contained safely upstairs and didn't run away. But that back side door was open. The thing that was notable to me though was my bike was where that side door was. And it was this one of these kind of light bikes, you could just pick it up and just fling it across the room. But it was as if somebody, a bike technician, had gently picked it up and had moved it over. I think that St. Francis image, this cross St. Damiano, spoke to that thief a little bit. Anyway, after that we knew where to put it. We knew that the response to violence is peace. So this cross hung on the door that was repaired, that one day was shattered by a thief. And that's where it was. Yeah.
Then who are the people, who are all the people on the...
So if anyone has that little book,
Yeah, we have a whole
yeah,
book
it's a
on
little
it,
book.
and you're welcome to borrow it. and-
this is a future Sunday school class
Yeah.
to peel apart this art and talk about every single thing that's on there. This is the Church of San Damiano today, and this is where that cross was. It's now been relocated to the Basilica up in Assisi. This is also the church cloister area where Clare and the Poor Clares end up living. What else?
I think just keep going. Let's see what else is next.
Okay.
That's it.
Francis went to fix a second church, and it was the Porta Nucola, this small church. So Assisi's up on a hill, down the hill, this small church. So once he had fixed that church of San Damiano, he went down to this one and did the same thing to repair it. And then upon the conclusion of repairing that church is I think when he had that idea that this is a bigger idea than just repairing these little churches. But interestingly enough, this church has been venerated and they've built a basilica over it. So there's a large basilica over this small church, and the original foundation from when Francis was there is still present. People have since built this little chapel over it.
And could I just
yeah.
interject? So, for those of you that have done traveling to other places, it's a very common practice to build over a holy site a church, right? So if you were to go to the Holy Land, there's Church Nativity of Bethlehem, where they built a church over the spot where Jesus is born. Church of Holy Sepulchre is supposed to be built over where Jesus was crucified. So this little church did not look like that in St. Francis's day. It's been embellished, as you can see. Through the centuries, they've added gold, they've added a bunch of things, looks quite fancy. But if you were to go there today looking for that little church, you might be, well, where is it? Well, we don't have a picture of it, but if you zoom out of this big, they built a big basilica over it, and then you find the little church inside. I must say, and some of you been there? If you were at Assisi, this lies on the outskirts of Assisi, but it's a beautiful place to visit, and there is a very special feeling when you go inside the sanctuary. It's very special.
Where is it in relation to Rome or Florence?
So
or where?
Assisi,
North.
Assisi is between Rome and Florence, but east. It's in Umbria, so you have Tuscany, and then Umbria is just to the east of it. It's kind of in that area. But I think one thing that's interesting for us being close to Los Angeles is the name of, we think of two big cities, right, in California. So we know obviously in the north was named after St. Francis, San Francisco. But did you know that there's a connection with Los Angeles too in St. Francis?
It's right here. This is, when you Google it, right, doesn't Los Angeles have a long name, a proper name? And then we ultimately shorten it to Los Angeles.
Yeah, the Angels.
The Angels. Yeah.
But it's named after this church.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Fascinating.
Just one remark. If you go to San Francisco North Beach, there's the National Shrine of St. Francis there, and they have a replica of the Presintula inside. It's a trip worth taking.
Okay. That's great. Did everybody hear that?
And all the frescoes in the church were painted by Italian artists.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sorry, your name?
Mia.
Mia was just sharing that in San Francisco, there's actually a replica of the chapel, which you pronounced it perfectly. Could you say it nice and loud for us?
Presintula.
That's the name of the church. Yes, thank you. And there's a replica, so you can go. So you don't have to go all the way to Italy. Although I wish for you that you could, because it's fun. But that would be nice. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's above San Francisco.
Well, we know St. Francis was a preacher, an itinerant preacher. And they at the time would have called him a fool, and he would say he was a fool for Christ. And there was reflecting on him being a fool with taking on that vow of poverty and the way he kind of looked and maybe his passion there. But we know that, and we have images in our art of Francis preaching to the birds. Perhaps he was practicing, right? Perhaps he had a special connection. We know he also preached to people, and he had a sense of poetry and drama and flair in what he was doing. We can thank St. Francis for the nativity set. So in 1223, Francis had this idea, and he put it forward to the Pope. Could he get permission to set up a manger with hay and live animals and use that as his backdrop for preaching the Christmas Eve sermon, right? To talk about the baby Jesus. So he invited the villagers up to gaze upon this scene, and they used the manger as the housing for the Eucharist. And that was the first instance in our universe of the nativity scene. Anything to add there, Nick? Clare joined Francis when she was 18. And this gives a bit of a summary of Clare. Her feast day is August 11th. She's also a primary saint of Italy. And interestingly, she is the first woman to write her own rule. So the rule of the Poor Clares, written by Clare and authorized by the church, is the first instance of a woman writing her own rule.
Yeah, and that actually didn't happen. It was on her deathbed where she got approval finally from the bishop. She had tried from the Pope getting approval for the order, and finally it came, literally, I think 2 days before she died. One thing we haven't really touched upon, so when she was 17, she first heard Francis preaching, and that's when she started to kind of wonder about this. Remember, she came from a very noble family. So when we talk about rebuilding the church and what that meant and how Francis initially took it as the literal, rebuilding the church that it kind of was in decay and ruin, and it became a kind of a much bigger idea. Just to give you an idea, at that time, monasteries were getting very wealthy, and a lot of it was because families were just kind of like Hildegard, who, remember, she was the tithe that went and they gave her to the church. There were a lot of women going into the church, and with them, their family would give land and a dowry. It was like they were getting married, right? They were getting married to Christ, married to the church. So all of a sudden, monasteries were starting to get, and abbeys were getting a lot more, they were amassing a lot of wealth. And so part of the radicalness of this is that this is where we see this turn where Francis is saying, wait, if we're really following in this Jesus way, what does that look like? And this is, we'll get into that in just a minute. So here you have Clare, who's hearing him talk about poverty and joy and following in the Jesus way and what that really means. And she's just thinking, wow. And something in her is getting very, very convicted. So a year later is when she has this time where she joins in with Francis. But remember, at that time, there were no other women joining in that. That came later. They were inspired by her, and then slowly but surely, they start to come as well. And I just want to mention that if you can imagine, her family was not happy about this. And apparently she had this beautiful long hair, and this actually cuts it off, and she's doing this thing. Well, at the end of the day, her dad passes away, and ultimately her mother and two sisters also joined the Poor Clares. So she had quite an influence as well. But yeah.
We have a kind of a pattern of angels visiting pregnant ladies, having babies. John the Baptist, Mary, and Jesus. The same pattern happened with Clare. And there's a reflection that's there that while she was in prayer, her mother heard a voice and received a prophecy about the child in her womb. Do not be afraid, woman, for you will give birth in safety to a light, which will give light more clearly than light itself. And so when the baby was born, she named her Clare, or the clear one, light and brightness. Amanda told the story of how when Clare was 18, she had this sense of following Francis. And the reflection that's there is on Palm Sunday morning, and this art here is depicting her in her finery, in her noble robes and her long hair. It says she was at Mass at the cathedral. Everybody went up to get their palm branches, but she remained in her place as if she was wrapped in a dream. It says, all eyes were upon the young girl as the bishop descended from the sanctuary and placed the palm in her hand. And that was the last time these people saw the noble girl Clare. Because later that day, based upon advice from Francis, she and her aunt and another companion went down to the chapel where Francis and his disciples met her. That's where they cut her hair, they traded out her clothing, her fine clothing, for the tunic and the thick veil. And so that was the day that we see as Clare turning into Saint Clare on March 20th, 1212. Anything to add there? Before I go, any further questions about Clare's moment here on Palm Sunday?
So a lot of what they were, really in Scripture, where a lot of this was for Francis, was taken from Matthew, where it says, take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey. So this idea that, take nothing with you when you go out to proclaim Christ. And so there is a Franciscan rule that he wrote, and it's still used today. But if you were to distill it, almost like, we have the Great Commandment that kind of distills all the commandments. The basic Franciscan rule is to follow the teachings of our Lord, Jesus Christ, and walk in his footsteps. And actually, there's sort of a motto that you hear that Franciscans are walking in the footprints of Christ. That's kind of how they would see themselves. And there's also, I'll let you see this one.
We have a number of quotes and things that are ascribed to St. Francis. One that we probably hear a lot, and that idea of preach the gospel, use words if necessary. Right? We ascribe to St. Francis, but actually it's not found in any of his writings or anything that's there. But one thing that is found in his rule is this statement: all the friars should preach by their deeds. It's the same sentiment. And what we see in Francis and Clare is about lifestyle. So Francis was a preacher, but he also was preaching probably more intensely and in a more amplified way through his life.
And just to add to that, he never really wanted to have a monastic life. He wasn't thinking of wanting to be a part of a cloistered type of monastery. He really wanted to be in the world, so to speak. So he sort of had, one foot in, one foot out. So he would go to his hermitage, sort of like Jesus going away to pray. But he was an itinerant preacher, and so were all the other Franciscans. The problem with Clare is, how was this lady going to do this in these times? Would not have been safe for her to go do that. So he put her at San Damiano. Initially they went to a Benedictine, her and a few followers that were starting up of the Poor Clares, until they got the San Damiano ready and it was repaired. And then she went with them and they started, that's where the Poor Clare. So if you were to go to a Poor Clare abbey or monastery today, they're a cloistered order. Although there are offshoots, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But but that doesn't mean that they aren't in relation with the world. It's just that they live and pray within the monastery and the grounds of the monastery. But for example, the Poor Clares, they would do embroidery and they would sell it. And then with the money, they would buy ingredients to buy bread, and they got healthy ingredients, the whole wheat, things like that, and they would make the bread and give it to the poor. That was one of their ministries. So they were dealing with the poor. People would bring sick people to them, and the legend goes, Clare would pray over them, and they would be healed. So they were very much a part of the community, but people would come to them. They would give them bread. They would give them spiritual advice, those kinds of things. But they lived within. But the guys, the Franciscan men, were preaching. They were out in the world. That was one of their main charisms, was to be out preaching in the world. Yeah.
You just said a word that I'm interested to learn more about: charism. What does that word mean?
So a charism, any of these orders, all have a certain, it's almost like ice cream and having a flavor. You know, are you chocolate, vanilla, strawberry? What's the essence of what this ice cream is? So a charism is the essence of the order. So, you know, all monasteries are orders are known for hospitality, but the one that would really be known for that are like the Benedictines, right? That was a big thing in the order for the Benedictines. Receive all as if they were Christ. So immediately when I hear Benedictine, I think, ooh, good hospitality. And Saint Bernard that we talked about last time, who was the Cistercian, who was a form of the Benedictines, they're really big on hospitality too. It's the same kind of charism. So for the Franciscans, they would have this charism, and the Poor Clares, that would be, we're going to talk about that more at the end, but there's certainly care of creation. There's the charism of, a big note for them would be poverty, right? This vow of poverty. And again, all orders usually have a vow of poverty of some kind. Franciscans would be the most extreme, right? But even within the Franciscans, and we'll see this a little bit later, there's a whole variety of ways to be a Franciscan. But the purest form would have been this extreme poverty that Francis practiced.
I think an important idea that's there is summarized in this quote from St. Clare, that to praise God by your very life. So the lifestyle that they had was a thing that people noticed and that infected others. And they had a sense of spiritual practice that would have been sustaining them and their relationship with God so that they could go out and take action. A modern day Franciscans, one of the folks that we listen to and read his books is Richard Rohr, and he has a center for the contemplation and action in New Mexico. And it's this sense of contemplation is this connection with God, listening to God, and then from that we take action out into the world, living as Christ's hands and feet. Well, the Sisters of St. Clare noticed that when she prayed, it had this mystical presence to it. It said, when she returned from prayer, her face appeared clearer than usual, and a certain sweetness came from her mouth. The sisters rejoiced as though she had come from heaven.
They also wrote down that often after she came out of meditation, she had an aura around her that was like a rainbow. And they wrote about that. Yeah, Jack.
What comes to my mind is one of her main responsibilities is she as a child, when she gives up everything, joins the Cistercian order, who takes care of the child? What happens to the child? Was it her child? Was she the one that had the child?
No.
Okay.
Clare is the child. Yeah.
She is.
Sorry. Yeah, Clare is the child we were talking
She's the child.
Yeah.
It's all together now.
Yeah. And I'd also just wanted to mention, if you were to read, and maybe some of you have already come across this, in fact, this was a book we had in one of my classes at seminary, Francis and Clare. This is a lot of their writings. It's just translations, but it's straight their words. And what you find in there a lot is this idea of, they talk about having perfection of the gospel. And somehow that word, every time I read it, it was kind of bristled me like, but we're not perfect, like what? You know, and so it was helpful for me when I learned that when they use that word perfection, a better word or translation for us to understand would be fullness, the fullness of the gospel. And that maybe gives us a little insight into when we sit down and really read these words of Christ, and we hear pick up your cross, and we hear leave everything behind, and don't take any gold, and just go out there. I mean, that's pretty radical. That's pretty wow. And yet, you know, sell everything you have and just go there. They did that. We have living witness of folks who did that. And that's who they are, and their followers. So pretty powerful. But to think of it as, if you did read any of their stuff, and you come across that word, you'll see it a lot, perfection of the gospel. It's really living within the fullness of the gospel message. Yeah.
It's nice to listen to when Jesus says, be perfect as I am perfect.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And you'll see that language all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And in other writers too, in other monastics too. It's the becoming perfect just as Christ is perfect. Absolutely. And that can, you know, there's a lot of unpacking you can do with that, but maybe just to also, as a companion to that word perfection, think of the word fullness, living in the fullness. Because we're limited in how full we can do that this side of the veil, right? So.
When I watched the movie Zeffirelli's Brother's Son, Mother's Moon, what really impacted me was how literally Francis took the challenge of living Jesus' gospel. And he actually made a very kind of soft revolution inside the church, because Rome back then was very pompous and very far from what the gospel was all about.
Yeah.
And he took to the rejected, the people with leprosy, and there's that beautiful scene when he builds his church with his bare hands, with the help of the poor and everything. And he brings all the wildflowers and the animals to the altar, and that's what that tradition we have on October 4th, to bring the animals to be blessed, the Francis blessing.
Right.
I just love how
Yeah.
literally he loved Jesus.
And Mia,
To me, he's the biggest example of, you know, and Clare as well.
yeah. And what I was going to say, Mia, too, to add to that, it's you know, if we think of the current Pope,
Exactly.
Taking
He's doing
on-
the same thing.
yes.
He's making
there's a
revolution.
reason why that name St. Francis.
And he's
Because
a-
St. Francis is all about, it's transforming some of that status quo, some of those things, shaking out the
Exactly.
cobwebs or whatever, and saying, wait, let's get back. What is our call?
Well, speaking of transforming the status quo, let's look at this other story here
Yes.
from St. Francis. So Francis, we know, was a peacemaker, and we have that resonance. This is a very important story. On your timeline, it's 1219 when this occurred. And Francis went with a brother of his and the armies of Western Europe down to Egypt as part of the Crusades. Francis had the desire to speak peacefully with the Muslims about Christianity. He was a preacher. He was going to go speak to them peacefully about Jesus, even if it meant dying for him. Right? So he had that sense of call and of conviction. It says, he tried to stop the Crusaders from attacking the Muslims at the Battle of Damietta, but he failed. After the defeat of the Western armies, he crossed the battle lines with his brother. He was arrested, he was beaten by the Arab soldiers, and was eventually taken to the Sultan. Francis has been here before. He was previously a soldier, he's previously been captured, he's previously been beaten. What's different now is he has this sense of his life following Jesus, and he has a different presence in what he's doing. And it says, as Francis came to the Sultan, the Sultan was known as a generous, kind, and fair ruler. It says he offered peace to the Crusaders 5 times. And according to Western accounts, he treated the defeated Crusaders humanely. And this Sultan's goal was to establish a peaceful coexistence with Christians. Well, interestingly, you get both of these two people together, Francis and the Sultan, both have an interest in peace, both are deeply convicted in their own faith traditions. And it says, after an initial attempt by Francis and the Sultan to convert the other, both quickly realized that the other already knew God. Francis acknowledged the Sultan knows God. The Sultan acknowledged Francis knows God. And it says that Francis and the Sultan and their respective people stayed together for 20 days discussing prayer and the mystical life. When Francis left, he was given an ivory trumpet, which is still in the archives there in Assisi. This encounter, we would point to, is a paradigm for interfaith dialogue. It's this first instance of interfaith, and this first instance of maybe stepping away from, I came here to convert you, I'm acknowledging God within you in your tradition, and I'm going to step back and appreciate it. And it happened for both the Muslim and the Christian together. This is a very important piece with St. Francis' story as he becomes known as a peacemaker. and how relevant it is for us still today. Last week, Amanda provided you a word, hagiography, and it's a two-part Greek word. Hagio is a combining form, which means saint or holy. You know, Hagia Sophia for the Holy Wisdom Greek Orthodox Church in LA. Graphy, the combining form for drawing, writing, representing, and recording. So hagiography is the writing and critical study of the lives of the saints. In St. Francis's tradition, there were stories and legends that then people began to tell after he passed, and then the same again with Clare, after she passed. And these were the stories that the brothers and sisters who lived closely with them told. So one thing we've learned about people who have mystical experiences is when a person shares their mystical experience, and the more they share it, the more the story about the mystical experience becomes the thing versus the experience itself. So there tends to be holding dear to one's heart these mystical experiences, and maybe only telling close people. That happened with Francis. When he had different experiences, his close friends knew, but others didn't. The people around him gathered these little flowers, or in Italian, florietti. And so the little flowers of St. Francis is a little book that has the legends and stories about Francis and Clare that captures these together. We know a lot about the saints themselves from some of these stories.
Yeah, and we have the book right here. And it's really fun because you can go through and there's just all these little stories of Clare, and some are long stories, some are short, of all these little things that happened. Go ahead.
And a couple examples I'll just go through quickly. This is one that you're familiar with. This is a painting from John August Swanson of Francis and the wolf at Gubbio. So the story that's there is Francis is in this little village of Gubbio. There's a wolf that's terrorizing the city, and it's this vicious wolf that has been killing livestock, killing men, and killing women, to a place where the city are living in fear, and people are in fear to leave. Francis, the story goes, had compassion on the people. He has compassion on their fear and the things holding them back from their life. And he decides to go out and meet the wolf. The story goes that all the people said, "No, don't do it, it's too dangerous. Don't go out there, Francis." He goes out by himself to meet the wolf, and it said the wolf kind of rose up to charge him, teeth bared, and Francis says, "In the name of Christ," and puts forward the crossing the wolf. And the wolf, it said, just sort of gently came down like a little kitten, closing his mouth and coming to Francis. The story is that Francis had this interaction with the wolf, that he asked the wolf to change his ways, to stop terrorizing the village, and the wolf agreed. And then Francis and the wolf go into the village with all these scared villagers, and he asks the villagers to reconcile with the wolf. This wolf is not here to terrorize you anymore. And so he kind of, in this story, goes over this bridge, so to speak, from isolation and fear into relationship and redemption. And the story concludes as the wolf lived peacefully with the people. He would go in and out of the homes, they would feed him for 2 years. And then when the wolf passed, the people mourned the wolf because they had they loved the wolf. Right? And when we think about these stories, these hagiographies, it could be that that's a factually true story. It could be that it's a legend that has other ideas, bigger ideas that are in there for us. Either way, what we do know is these stories pass verbally from person to person and amplify and are part of the tradition. If you Google St. Francis and the Wolf or look for art on St. Francis and the Wolf, you'll find it everywhere.
While Eric's teeing up the next slide, a few other little short stories about that you can find in here about Clare. One, the bishop came to visit San Damiano and the sisters there. She was getting ready for communion and was blessing the bread, and after she blessed it, a cross appeared on the bread. That was one of the stories. Another story where she took one loaf of bread and was able to feed all of the sisters, 50 of them, and all of the Franciscans that were there in Assisi. So kind of a feeding of the 5,000 sort of thing. So those are the kind of stories that you find in here. And then there's this one, which is a really big one.
This is a story where similar to the wolf terrorizing the city, an army was coming to terrorize San Damiano. And Clare's sisters let her know. At this time, she was kind of late in life, was feeble, and she said, "Carry me." And she took with her the host, the holy host, the body for the Eucharist. And it said she was fearless, had a fearless heart. She commanded her sisters to lead her to the enemy with her silver and ivory case. What's that called?
Like a monstrous?
Monstrous.
But I don't know
Yeah.
if it's holding the Eucharist, there might be a special name for that.
Host.
It's not the tabernacle, but I don't know.
Okay,
Anyways.
anyway. You just found us on the edge of our knowledge of Catholicism. So, but Clare asks God to protect the city, and the legend is, as the soldiers look up and see Clare and see her holding up the host, they put down their weapons and turn around and leave. Right? The similar story of kind of meeting violence and leaving it with peace. Real quick, stigmata. Francis, one of the legends of Francis, he received the stigmata, which is the wounds of Christ. And so the story that's there is that he was beginning to go on a 40-day fast, the Feast of St. Michael, was met by an angel who had 6 sets of wings, had also the marks of Christ, and that in that exchange, Francis received these marks. So it would have been the last couple of years of his life. They said that he had wounds on his hands, wounds on his feet, and a wound in his side that was like the spear wound of Christ. And in the legend and in the story, Francis doesn't really talk about the stigmata very much. Only those very closest to us who were helping him would recognize that he was bleeding constantly from that side wound, and they saw that as a sacred thing. So this becomes, in the kind of Catholic tradition, the stigmata becomes a very, I guess, important, holy mystery. And there are other people since Francis who have received that as well. I'll leave it like that. One last short story from the autobiography is of St. Clare. So we talked earlier that she's the patron saint of eye disorders and of television. Well, the reason is because when she was old, she was not able to make it into the sanctuary for Mass. And the story is that she could see through the wall the holy altar and could partake in the Mass through her vision. And so she was the patron saint of eye disorders. And then in the late 50s, the Pope thought, the first person to see a television, right? So she's that. And the Greek word for television is vision from afar, right? So that was St. Clare. Well, both Francis and Clare died. St. Francis died in 1226 on the evening hours of October 3rd, so October 4th is his feast day. It said that he asked his brothers to read Psalm 142 as he was passing. So that was our last point with St. Francis, Psalm 142. St. Clare died.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
And one fun thing to know too is that it was said that the day he died, that all of these larks, this was St. Bonaventure who wrote about it, but this was passed down, this describes a gathering of larks which appeared, and this is in quotes, at the hour of the holy man's passing. They came in a great flock over the roof of the house and on the whirling around for a long time with unusual joy, gave clear and evident testimony of the glory of the saint who so often invited them to praise God. So he was known for preaching to the animals, including the birds, and they would all, we didn't really touch on that, but you can read about that. There's all stories about that. But when he died, the day he died, could you imagine if you're there and this whole flock of birds come and are singing and are all around him, and that's what happened.
And then in 1253, Clare died on August 11th. Her feast day is now August 14th. Her last words, "Blessed be you, O God, for having created me." These pictures are ones that Amanda took in San Damiano of the location where Clare was upon her passing, and then the center courtyard at the cloister there in San Damiano. So now we'll end with some reflection on the modern day legacy that's there.
Yeah, this is just a nice visual because it's showing a tree. the main thing I want to show you is when you see first order, second order, third order, it's not that it's chronological so much as it is they're different branches. So first order, we won't go into it all, but the friars minor would be kind of like the original ones, and you had a few offshoots, which we don't have time to really get into. Second order.
How about capuchin?
Yeah, just tell the fun fact about that, and then we'll.
It's where the word cappuccino comes from.
That's the color of their garments. Poor Clares were the second order, right? So that's the woman order, and they're sisters in the Capuchin order as well. And then this third order, which you notice that there's one called secular Franciscans, and I just wanted to point this out. This isn't a new thing that's come about in the last couple hundred years. You know, this was founded by when Francis was still alive, by Francis. Because what he had happening when he was going to these towns, you had people coming up saying, well, I don't want to, I have a family, and I don't want to give up that life and become religious, you know, but I want to live this way. But what does that look like for, and I think that speaks maybe to us today a little more too, but how amazing that there are folks even back then that had that desire to live more simply, to put Christ in front of everything they do. And what does that look like for somebody who is also has a vocation doing something else? I mean, isn't that really what we're all striving for? So there is an order that's still around today, and it's called the secular, it's not with these folks, but anyways, yeah, we have to fly through this, but I wanted to show you, this is a Poor Clare hermitage in Northern Ireland. This is my friend Geraldine, Sister Geraldine, and we did our spiritual direction course together, and she's wonderful because one of the things that the sisters do there is they do spiritual direction. People come from the town and they do direction there. There she is in plain dress, and there she is in her, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, it's self-explanatory, right? But this is a little bit, I have two things I want to make about this slide. First, about their order. It's a little bit of an offshoot. So most Poor Clares, if you were to visit today, are cloistered, and they have the full habit. They're fully, you know, the black with the white, and they don't leave they're cloistered. They don't go out into the world so much. I mean, they can go outside of their thing, but they're not going to be ministering in that way. Geraldine, they have a different approach, and they can be in the world somewhat, so they can go in, and when they do, they can wear plain clothes. So she has done that. So one of the ways they sustain their order is a lot of them are artists and photographers, and they make cards and they sell them. So they're going out in the world to do those things so that they can make money. But same thing, they're doing work within the community, helping the poor, just the way the Poor Clares did before. One of the things that's really interesting is they combine the Franciscan charisms with a lot of the Celtic charisms that we see from the Irish monasteries and saints. Because if you think about it, in the Irish tradition, it was care of creation. It was all a lot of similar things. And so they're doing this interesting hybrid here, where they've got these things connected. So the one thing I just wanted to point out to you that was, I thought, very interesting, they believe Francis, historians believe Francis went to Bobbio in northern Italy that was founded, a monastery founded by an Irish monastic. And that he was very influenced there. This was very young when he was first starting out. And if you look, this shows you what an old Irish monastery type monastic city would have been like. The church is in the center, and you have these hermitages all around. So that was kind of the model for it. That's like what my friend Geraldine, they've done that same thing. These are the little hermitage houses, which I've stayed at. They're lovely. And then this is the center. They've made theirs like the Trinity. It's really interesting architecture. But this picture over here, which might be hard to see, is a picture in Italy of, Mia, say the church for us again, nice and loud, the church.
Zincola. Zincola.
Thank you. That's that church right there in the center, and those are the hermitages around. That's how St. Francis set up his quote-unquote monastery. It really wasn't a monastery, but that little area is where he set that up. So then these are just a few things from Assisi. If you were to go there, and I know some of you have, and you maybe picked one of these up, on all the doorposts you'll see Pace and Bene or Pax y Bona, peace and good. If there's one motto that the Franciscans have, it's this. And the idea is that you put this by your doorway, so that as you come and leave, peace and goodness, and to those that enter, peace and goodness. And so you see these all over the town. We stayed in this lovely place, and it was a modernized 14th century townhome. And we go inside, and there was a little balcony, and the girls are with us. We step off, and we look to the right, and what do we see? 2 doves. So it just felt like the spirit of St. Francis was there, for sure. We had the birds. When you walk down to San Damiano, there's a olive grove. It's just beautiful. Here's a picture of where he's buried, the Basilica of St. Francis. That's a statue of him as he was coming back from his wartime. And then finally, this is an actual garment that Francis wore. And you notice that it makes the shape of the Tao, which is the cross that they wear. And there's kind of a story about that, but also wanted to mention that that's how Francis would sign his name, with that cross, that Tao.
These are some of Amanda's friends. When we were in San Damiano, we saw, it's probably the #1 tourist site for Franciscans worldwide is Assisi, right? So we saw folks coming there. These are some guys who were coming down to San Damiano, and this is just a gentleman there. Hard to resist getting a picture of a Franciscan in front of, St. Francis Basilica.
So I guess finally to wrap it up, these are Franciscan values. You'll find these values listed in Franciscan universities. It's kind of like distills it down to a few basic things. This is some of the legacy we have from the Franciscans.
Sure, and I think it's something that we can relate to, and it probably seems like very natural things to us, right? Revere the unique dignity of each person. So we see that in Francis. His interaction with the leper, right? Francis kissing a leper is Francis having a relationship with somebody who's on the margin. But he's seeing the unique dignity of each person, right? Encouraging a trustful, prayerful community of learners. So it's about community. It's how are we together understanding our life together and our life with the Holy? How are we learning from each other? How are we trusting and prayerful? It's serving one another, serving society, and serving the church. So it's a very universal idea that we can really kind of understand and get behind. Fostering peace and justice. So I think we see some amazing stories that are there in Francis's life. And part of the legacy of that, of how do we deal with very difficult situations, how do we deal with terrorizing situation and bring the love of Christ to it. And then the respect for creation. The sense that we're all part of it, and the holy is in all of the creation around us.
So we wanted to close with a prayer that has widely been attributed to St. Francis, and it's another thing that actually he did not write, but it's attributed to him nonetheless because it really speaks to everything he would stand for. But before we close with that, are there any other comments or thoughts, questions? And we can stick around a little bit too if you have a more involved question. But
it speaks to the power and the influence and the specialness and the holiness. This guy was only 45 when he died. He accomplished and he left such an incredible legacy. And he's 45 years old, when just like Jesus was 33, but that's, Jesus. But what I mean is, 45 years old. I mean, I know people didn't live that long in those days, but it's amazing. He did so much and left such a powerful thing. And he died at what we would call just middle age.
yeah. Yes.
I want to thank you both for an incredible presentation. It was clear and you made it, for me anyhow, very understanding and with interesting highlights that you personally experienced, put together with the more academic part, and it was a wonderful blessing to us all.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
And there are books over here you're welcome to look at. And there's lots of devotional books. There's so much material on Francis and Clare. and they've been made into Lenten devotionals and Advent devotional, all kinds of stuff. Yes?
You had cookies last time, I was wondering if you had wheat. You have wheat bread this time?
Francis had a very special recipe for donuts that the local donut person has taken on, and there's some out there.
So let's pray together the simple prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, unity. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is error, truth. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. Where there is darkness, light. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life.
Thank you.
I think you guys will